I want to thank everyone for coming. If I could have your attention, please. And if the speakers could take their seats. Mr. Delacour. My name is Steve Wasserman. I'm publisher and executive director of Heyday Books here in Berkeley, California, independent nonprofit publisher, founded by Malcolm Margolin for its first 43 years. And Malcolm is in the house, and we welcome him here. We are now in our 45th year of publication, and it is a great privilege to welcome you all to the Brower Center, and also to remind folks that if you have questions, you've been given presumably pieces of paper on which you could write those questions. They'll be funneled up to me. And we are being aired live by KPFA. So I want to thank our colleagues at KPFA for bringing this event and making possible a listenership much greater than the 178-seat capacity theater here at the Brower Center. Each speaker will have about 5 minutes to compress 5 decades worth of reflection. And inevitably, this evening will be something of a disappointment because no historical deep dive into a thorny and knotty history such as People's Park presented, certainly no history as described by participants who, as any lawyer in the House knows, eyewitnesses often make the worst witnesses, and people had very different experiences. Nonetheless, we thought it good to bring together a kind of Greek chorus to describe what was, for many of us, a hinge moment, not only in our own personal development, but also in the history of the country, and indeed certainly of the city. Berkeley, in the years that I came of age, and I was then a junior, newly elected student body president at Berkeley High School in 1969, Berkeley in those years was heady with the scent of night jasmine and tear gas. It whipsawed, sometimes violently, between cliches, from the age of Aquarius to the age of apocalypse and back. Months before the first sod was rolled on the abandoned lot that became People's Park, and long before white kids found themselves in the crosshairs of shotgun-wielding police, Berkeley was rife with rebellion. And it would do to any real understanding of those events to remind us that the Bay Area had been engulfed for decades by multiple and successive protests. The most notable included the Anti-House Un-American Activities Committee protests of 1960, the great civil rights sit-ins of the spring of 1964 at the Sheraton Palace Hotel in San Francisco, along with the Auto Row demonstrations seeking an end to racial discrimination, which began in late 1963 and continued through the spring of '64. The free speech movement, of course, in the fall of '64, followed by one of the nation's first teach-ins organized by the Vietnam Day Committee, and some of those veterans are here in the audience. In May '65, and 3 months later, the efforts to prevent the passage of troop trains through Berkeley. And then, of course, came the founding of the Black Panther Party in 1966, and the anti-draft demonstrations in Oakland in 1967, and then the use of tear gas to disperse the May 1968 demonstration on the corner of Haste and Telegraph to show solidarity with striking French students. One of those demands, an imperishable demand, is be realistic, demand the impossible. We took that to heart. It was followed by the violent effort to break the Third World Liberation Strike at Cal in February 1969, and it culminated in the ruthless suppression of People's Park protesters in May '69, which saw the death of one onlooker, the blinding of another, the indiscriminate gassing of the campus by a National Guard helicopter, the imposition of martial law, and the month-long occupation of the entire city by thousands of armed troops. It is hard at this remove, 50 years later, to apprehend what the critic Greil Marcus once called the moods of rage, excitement, loneliness, fatalism, and desire that buffeted Berkeley and the world in those turbulent years. Upheaval was the order of the day, from New York to London, Paris to Prague, Mexico City to Chicago, Berlin to Berkeley, and the zeitgeist seemed to be one of extraordinary possibility. Making history became both an individual and collective imperative. The personal became political, and vice versa. Passivity and complacency were out, activism and participation in. The upwelling of People's Park embodied these yearnings, particularly a politics of joy. The stark and brutal smashing of our hopes was a hammer blow. The immediate aftermath of People's Park coincided with a growing romance with ideology and a sense that the apocalypse loomed. Despair deepened, extremism beckoned. Berkeley in those years contained less a politics than a collection of extremely seductive moral sympathies. A year later at Kent State in Ohio, 4 white students were killed protesting the widening war in Indochina, while 2 weeks later, 2 black kids were gunned down at Jackson State in Mississippi. The iron fist of the state played well with an electorate who saw us as little more than petulant brats who ought no longer to be indulged by hardworking taxpayers. The strategy worked. Ronald Reagan, then the governor of the state of California, catapulted to national prominence and would embark on his ultimately successful campaign to win the White House 10 years later and to launch the long counter-revolution to undo the achievements of the New Deal. People's Park, in the end, could reasonably be regarded as a largely self-inflicted wound, a wound that revealed our naivete as a noose by which the right wing sought to hang an entire movement opposed to the imperial Moloch that Allen Ginsberg had so eloquently denounced. Meanwhile, Lot 1875-2, which was the technical designation for the block bounded by Haste and Dwight Way, Telegraph, and Bowditch, it lay untended for years, an open, suppurating sore. Fitful efforts to revive it would recur. Today, Cal's overseers plot its final vanishing, unsentimentally regarding the blood-soaked lot as a site to build much-needed student housing in an increasingly gentrified town, whose aging rebels blow hard upon the embers of their vanished youth. A struggle for memory and against forgetting is reignited amid hopes for a peaceful resolution of a battle that for some has never truly ended. A half-century after Berkeley's bloody Thursday, 50 years ago today, its legacy is still not well understood. And this evening is dedicated, as is the book we have published about People's Park, it's dedicated to trying to elicit a more subtle sense of what a historical moment contains and what is needed by such a moment. And I hope that this evening will not suggest that an autopsy means that the moment of exhausted possibilities is at hand. Without saying any more from me about all this, we have a number of speakers. I want to introduce them briefly, welcome them to the podium, and the first up is Tom Dalzell. He's the author of The Battle for People's Park, Berkeley, 1969, and is the elected leader of Local 1245 of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and first came to Berkeley in the summer of 1968 to work for Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers in Delano. Tom.
You know, I look out and I'm really honored by some of the faces I'm seeing. At the risk of just mentioning a few and hurting the feelings of others, let me just point out Anita and Lee, great veterans of the free speech movement, here with us tonight. So 55 years later. Brother Minkus, who made soup for People's Park in those garbage cans. You know, every time I look at those pictures, I think, I don't think I would have eaten it, but it was a different time. There are a number of the photographers here. Where's John Jacobson? John Jacobson, the Barb photographer at the time. Jim Chanin. Jim? There you are. rock salt, or something shot into him. When Steve said we're not here for an autopsy, that's because although we focused on 40 days and 40 nights, that was not the end of the story of People's Park. And the story continues, the struggle continues. Michael Delacour still bleeds People's Park, and again at the risk of leaving people out, Carol Denny's here, and Carol is a central figure in keeping the vision going. I do a sort of trivial but loving blog and column in Berkeley side that's called Quirky Berkeley. And, I've walked every block of every street in Berkeley, and I take pictures of the weird things in the yards and celebrate that part of Berkeley, that creativity and unique personality of Berkeley. And that spilled over into a love of history, especially in the 1950s and 60s. And with the 50th anniversary of People's Park coming up, in a Gestalt moment, I said, well, there should be a book about the 50th anniversary. Malcolm had published my two Quirky Berkeley books, so I went to Heyday, which was then Steve, and I don't think I got halfway through the first sentence of my pitch, and we had a book. And I interviewed 110, 120 people who had been there, read accounts from another 300,